What's up, folks? This is Justin Garcia, aka Master Chim, and on the line I have a very special guest from the SOUTHLANDers group, Mr. Simon Roche. Simon, say hello to the Pressure Project listeners, please.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me, Justin, and thanks for listening, everybody.
No, absolutely. I'm very happy that we finally found a way to make this work. Now that you're here, there's a lot to talk about, and you, I would say, unlike a lot of the guests that I have on the Pressure Project, you have probably a very important mission, more directly important than most. You know, one of the things that we have here, a luxury, if you will, here in the U.S., is we get to talk about big things. We get to talk about the what ifs and the abstract and your plight, your operation, your mission is a little bit more meat and potatoes, as we say. You got to get stuff done because you have a direct necessity for it. Do me a favor, Simon. Walk everybody through your story, how you came to be part of the organization, and let's explore what it is that your organization is trying to accomplish.
Okay, well, I'm a 46-year-old white male from South Africa, and I am the head of the HQ for an organization called SOUTHLANDERS, which is a civil defense organization preparing for a civil defense role in an anticipated civil war in South Africa. So we're not militant, we're not militaristic, but we are preparing to operate in civil war circumstances. I grew up in an area of South Africa which is noted for its kind of half liberalism, if you like. And I grew up in a conservative family, went to university and discovered politics. At the time, shortly before the African National Congress Party of Nelson Mandela won the first open elections in South Africa in 1994, on the 27th of April, 1994. So at university, I felt that there was a good reason why we as white South Africans should be sympathetic to the black populace's position. In other words, sympathetic to democracy, sympathetic to a change, sympathetic to everything that goes with it. And I participated very heavily in that. And along came 1994 and the African National Congress won the elections, and I entered an industry which does a lot of work for the government, for the state of South Africa, and indeed for the African National Congress Party, namely live event production, so conferences and similar sorts of things. And I never worked directly for the African National Congress, but I did work for the African National Congress, either in my personal capacity or as an employee of a company putting on a large conference, or an outdoor concert as part of the celebrations of a public holiday, for example, and so on and so forth. And over about 20 odd years, I began to do more and more sensitive work for the government, budgets and other things, and I became more exposed to the rot that is the ANC. The African National Congress is rotten to its core, and there's just no two ways about that. At the same time, I became conscious of the murder and rape of whites in South Africa, inordinately high crime levels, such as are almost not found anywhere else in the world. And it became clear to me that my people, as a small majority, about 8.5% of the population of South Africa, were facing an existential threat. So about 3 years ago, I began to become more and more involved in kind of behind the scenes preparing for a crisis. I don't own a firearm, which is just as well in my case. I wasn't preparing militantly or militaristically at all, but I was preparing baked beans, if you like, maps, that kind of thing. And during that time, the rhetoric against white South Africans became more and more fervent. So my timing was quite good. I continued to do work for the ANC. During the daytime, I did my job. I remained loyal to my bosses, the people for whom I worked, and that work that I did remains confidential, and I'm very proud to say that. Nevertheless, in the evenings, I would begin to work further and further on this sort of preparation, and over time, I worked myself into a position where I'm now the head of the headquarters for, you could call it the shadow headquarters of our organization, the headquarters that will be affected if indeed a race-based civil war breaks out, as black leaders in South Africa are now saying openly will happen.
All right, so a lot to unpack there. Firstly, prior to the ANC taking over in '94, what I like to call, from an outsider, the fall of South Africa, what did you expect? Because it sounded like you were very open-minded, somewhat sympathetic, as you had said. What did you expect to happen? What were, the people who were in your boat, maybe not extreme on either end, but just the person who was where you were in that society at that time? What were the optimistic expectations of that change of power?
Justin, to be honest, and I hope that this doesn't sound like a very, very stupid thing to say, but to be honest, I thought about it often, and I was never clear in my mind what would happen. I had perhaps a sense of foreboding, but it seemed as if, on balance, the right thing to do was to give everybody a place in the sun. On balance, regardless that there might be challenges along the way, the right thing to do was to give everybody a place in the sun. That's the best answer I can give you.
Okay, so what were some of the changes that you noticed? Because obviously, wherever South Africa is right now was not the case at the time of that transition.
Yes.
What slowly began to happen that brought us from that point to this one?
Well, I think the first thing that began to happen was corruption on a massive scale. People like to sweep this under the carpet, but any close examination of missing funds and budgetary expenditure and what have you reveals that almost from day one, the African National Congress plundered the state coffers at every level, or let's say government coffers at every level. So that is to say municipal government in towns and cities, regional governments in provinces, and the national government as well. That was the very, very first thing that we began to see. A massive arms deal was done, which was quoted at about $1 billion, give or take, at the time, that ended up costing well over $12 billion. And since then, it's turned out that everybody had their hand in the pie, and they stole like you can't believe. The next thing that began to happen was a conspicuous decline in our health services. Following that, there was a marked decline in the education in South Africa. Now, many people were obliged by their consciences to overlook that because education had been separated along racial lines. So it would be very difficult for a white person to say, well, my child's education is becoming rubbish, because the counter argument would be, we are now sharing the resources equitably, and we are pulling up the standard of education in the black townships. However, over time, it became clear that the standard of education in the black townships was plummeting, and the education in the cities and in the suburbs, in the formerly white areas, at the formerly white schools, was also declining. I can tell you many, many anecdotes about that because I have children. So I read the textbooks and I see the absolute nonsense, the absolute complete inability of the people who now write the textbooks to do basic arithmetic or to have any comprehension of rudimentary geography. The fourth thing, in my estimation, that began to happen is that the internal administration became very weak. That is to say, to get a passport or an identity document, which is the equivalent of your social security card in the USA, became a shambles, is the best way of putting it. The department in question became infamous for its hopeless inability to administer those services in the country. Beyond that, we then saw a decline in the police force, quite a radical decline. And then everything else began to crumble. But I'd say those were the kind of first 5 obvious steps. Massive pillaging of state funds, decline in state health services, decline in education, and the decline in the government's ability to provide basic administrative type support. And then, of course, many challenges with the police department. But before I finish, I'd like to add that we began to see the same thing in municipalities. So the municipal rates and taxes on properties went up quite drastically. The new mayors gave themselves fantastic increases, as much as 100%, or in 1 or 2 cases, 1,000% in a year. And the roads just went to rack and ruin. So there are many, many, many stories like that.
So now, obviously, this begs the question, or I should say, it's very hard to not start triggering people who are very sensitive to these conversations. What is the component, or components, plural, of the ANC's organization that created such, what we say here in America, a clusterfuck?
The African National Congress, it's hard to say, but I've spent some time in the African National Congress's headquarters, and I've spent 25 years doing events and projects for the African National Congress. So I think that I can give an educated guess, is probably 98% Black African. Yeah, there's some whites, some Indians. We have a fairly large population of Indians in South Africa, and then mixed race people who insist on not being regarded as black people and insist upon being called colored people. And I would say that the ANC, about 98%, I would guess, I should think. I don't think that could be far wrong.
So now, let me ask a better question. Why would you say the ANC turned South Africa on its head once it got control? And let me lead it in 2 directions, and let me know if these directions are off completely. Is it the individuals involved, or is it maybe an incompatibility in the culture of the people who made up the ANC, with the system that was awaiting them when they took control?
You know, it's very difficult to say. I think that the inherent culture of the African National Congress as a revolutionary organization was a toxic culture. I think that there are not many revolutionary organizations in the world which are inherently virtuous. I think that the kind of people who plant bombs and disrupt and destroy and damage and break tend not to be wholesome people, let's say. And there are some exceptions. I've met people in the ANC whom I admire for their personal character traits. Good people. But as an organization, as a revolutionary organization, as a dyed-in-the-wool communist organization, the ANC never ever had the benevolence that the world media attached to it. Right. I think that the ANC, the people of the ANC, and as a group, the organization did a very good job of smiling for the cameras and waving, and Nelson Mandela was such a good-looking, tall, handsome man, and what a beautiful smile, and so on and so forth. But I think behind the cameras, having dealt with the African National Congress extensively for a long period of time, in different circumstances, from the lowest levels to the very highest, it's fair to say that they're not good people. The African National Congress is not an organization of good people.
Right. So now in society in South Africa, things went from the government that existed prior to the ANC taking over in 94 to the ANC taking over, and the slow decline of the state of South Africa's efficiency, effectiveness, power, influence. Obviously, I mean, it's apparent at this point. It's not really up for debate. But the white population of South Africa had a very unique experience in terms of their citizenship, how they were treated, both officially and unofficially. Tell us a little bit about how being a white South African transformed from pre-94 all the way up to what it is today that your organization has a need for existing.
Yes. Well, prior to 1994, we had an extremely conservative society that was very law-abiding by and large. Obviously, during the 80s, there was a lot of political activity, many riots, and just disruptions to the economy through strikes. But by and large, it was a law-abiding society. And I'll give you some random examples. Up until 1975, television was banned in South Africa because the government believed that it would have an insidious, insubordinating influence upon the people. Nothing happened on Sundays in the 70s. It changed in the 80s to some extent, but Sundays were quiet days. Nothing happened. Nothing was allowed to happen because it was a Christian country. Gambling was completely and utterly forbidden. Following 1994, these things were all undone. Abortion on demand is very easy. Recently, there was an interview with a health official who described a girl of 13 who'd had 8 abortions paid for by the state by that time. She might have been 11. I'm going to stick with 13, but I have a feeling that she might have been younger. We see a situation now in which the African National Congress and the liberals, many white liberals in South Africa, proudly tout our constitution as the most liberal constitution in the world. So in theory, we're the most liberal country in the world. It's well and good for liberals to love that kind of thing. Of course, I'm going to hate it as a conservative, as a Christian. But what has gone hand in hand with this terrific, wonderful, idealistic, harmonious liberalizing of our society is that there's been a tremendous decline in the performance of the society. So, for example, we now have just 3.2 million taxpayers and 16.3 million people on social grants. We have an unemployment rate which the government puts at about 25%, but every independent analyst worth his salt says is between 35 and 40%. One or two say that it should be over 50%, and there is a reason for that. I won't go into it now, but it's not as much of a thumbsuck as it might sound. There's a very good reason for it. We have a situation where crime is out of hand. More than 74,000 white people have been murdered by black people in the intervening 23 years since the beginning of democracy on the 27th of April 1994. The point being that our society is crumbling wherever you look. The education is woefully poor. The policing is in a severe crisis. Our army is a shadow of what it once was. I'll give you one example. We have 1,200 infantry fighting vehicles, rattle, that is to say honey badger fighting vehicles in our official order of battle, of which at least, and it's recorded this way, 666 are inoperable. And so the list goes on and on and on and on and on, whether you talk about the military or health or education or administration or theft. or murder or rape. We have fantastically high levels of rape. 1 in 3 women, I'm speaking now of all women, not just white women, 1 in 3 women in South Africa will be raped. This is the generally acknowledged, accepted figure. Rape being a very underreported thing, it's difficult to know precisely whether it's 33.33% or 29.75%, but it is around about 1 in 3 women that is generally accepted by most institutions as the number who will be raped in the course of their lifetime. Wherever you look, the society is imploding.
Incredible, incredible. And, it's funny, but you hear, 1 in 3 women will be raped. And, you think of number one, the severity of it, obviously, but then the legitimacy of the actual number. This isn't, what so many liberals here, they like to say that I think it's 1 in 5 women will be sexually assaulted at some point. And they use like this voodoo type of magic statistical, computation to get that number. And it's even a reach, in the severity of it, because we just kind of all know, and maybe I'm being somewhat biased, but we kind of all know it's bullshit when we hear that. In South Africa, it's not bullshit. In South Africa, this is happening.
Well, I use conservative figures. As you know, Justin, we are touring the USA, giving presentations on our plight and explaining why we are desperately raising funds in a last-ditch attempt to prepare for this civil war, imminent civil war. And when we present to people all across the USA, as we are doing on this road trip, I use conservative figures because that way I'll never get into trouble for them. So many of the figures that I quote are in fact from liberal sources,
right?
Such as the figures of the rape are from liberal sources, from various women's organizations which are distinctly liberal. There's a chap in the USA, a politician who would not wish his name to be mentioned, who is privately encouraging us, from time to time, and we've had some conversations. He's not involved in the tour. He hasn't donated any money to us, but he's a politician who thinks that we're doing good work. And we've spoken on a few occasions, and he said to me, I wish you would stop saying that it was 74,000 white people that had been murdered by black people. He said, because I have an office full of researchers, and it is, how did he put it? I think the word he used was incontrovertible. It's not possible for there to be a controversy around this. Incontrovertible that the very minimum number is 126,000. But if I say 74,000, I'm never going to get into trouble for it. If I say 1 in 3 women and it comes from a liberal source, I'm never going to get into trouble for it. It's never going to be contentious. People are going to hesitate before they criticize what we say. So that's just an observation on what you were.
Well, I give you permission to at least say 75,000 moving forward. All right. So, now, and I don't mean to laugh about this. It's just the absolute, just preposterous nature of this situation playing itself out in a land that prior to 94 was thought of as this throwback to this arcane, slavery-ridden, just oppressive, type of reality. When the fact was that prior to 94, South Africa was a technological elite on the planet.
Oh, yes.
It was in some way, a utopian-like reality because so many people were congruent in their individual missions and dedication to that reality. Now, obviously, and I don't want to go too far in any direction controversially, but prior to there being the established government in South Africa, let's just say there was not an established government in South Africa. So, so this, this group, this organization, this identity that took over this basically elite first world government was woefully unqualified, unprepared. Some would say, poorly intended. But whatever the case is, the necessity for an organization like SOUTHLANDERS has has evolved to reality.
Yeah.
What are you guys preparing for, and what are those preparations?
Justin, we're preparing for a race-based civil war, to put it bluntly. The protocols additional to the Geneva Conventions, which are intended to govern the prosecution of war with particular reference to civilians in circumstances of armed conflict, make specific provision for identifiable groups of people to gather together and claim the protection of international law, assuming that certain criteria are met. So let's say you were my mortal enemy and I was walking down the street and you came up and punched me on the nose. I couldn't then say, Justin punched me. Clearly there's a terrible bias here and he's going to come and murder me in my bed tonight. It doesn't work like that. The very stringent criteria have to be met. And only once those criteria are met in circumstances of an open armed conflict can we then exercise our mandate as a civil defense organization devoted to the protection of white women and children in conflict circumstances. So if you say, what are we preparing? I would say that the first thing that we're preparing is a method for people to leave the cities and to gather together in safe havens, and ultimately to gather together in one safe area where under international law we can then declare a kind of a perimeter. We are preparing food, fuel, medicine, and communications. To keep it simple, obviously the list is longer, but food, fuel, medicine, communications, and shelter would cover about 95% of the preparatory work that we're doing. We're preparing to receive refugees into safe havens declared under international law. We're preparing to guide convoys of people from all over South Africa along the safest routes possible. We're preparing to build little societies within those safe havens. So much of the preparatory work that we're doing has got nothing to do with, let's say, defending a perimeter or fancy schmancy, HF radio communications. Some of it has just got to do with ensuring that our members provide leadership when it comes to ensuring that the sewerage system continues to run properly and that the water reticulation and refining system runs properly, and so on and so forth. Just the ordinary run-of-the-mill society needs.
All right. So as far as the conflict that this would be reactionary toward, are you expecting the blacks to eventually one day just start hunting you guys down officially? Or do you expect some type of insurrection between a resurgent old, guard, if you will, trying to basically move its way back into the capitals?
Yeah, no, I don't think that anybody in their right mind is contemplating that. There are some fools, certainly, but definitely not people in their right mind, who have contemplated that in the past. I can tell you that it makes no sense to dream of overthrowing the government of South Africa. It makes no sense whatsoever. The reason why we're doing this is not because we have, revanchist visions of being at the top of the pile again. Far from it. That I don't think will ever happen. What is rather the case is that black leaders have over time begun to speak more and more openly about a race-based civil war. For example, on the 10th of April this year, a very senior black leader said that conservative whites will be wiped out within 5 years in South Africa unless they learn to behave themselves. There'd been a flurry of criticism of the government just after we were downgraded by Moody's, Fitch's, and Standard & Poor's. Our sovereign bonds had been downgraded to junk. And many conservative whites said, right, that's the end of our economy. It's a disaster of the first order. And so this guy came out and said, well, look, we're going to kill all whites within 5 years, unless they learn not to be so critical of the government. On the 21st of April, Friday the 21st of April, a very senior black leader by the name of Julius Malema said that the government should stop preventing the proletariat from getting at whites. Now, I don't know how the government is preventing that, because if they're preventing it, they haven't been preventing it very well. But he said it is time now to let the black people of South Africa get to the whites and take them on. So open threats. On the 7th of November last year, that same guy, who is extremely influential, extremely powerful politician, said in the town of Newcastle in the province of KwaZulu-Natal to a group of supporters, and it's on YouTube, it's well recorded, I am not calling for the slaughter of all whites yet. And so the list goes on. One of our leading political observers, who is a brother of one of our former presidents, said at the launch of his book last year in October that we are standing on the cusp of a race-based civil war and that it is now inevitable. A former judge president of South Africa, in other words, our most senior judge in our legal system, in the structure of our legal system, said that a race-based civil war is inevitable. Black leaders are speaking openly about the slaughter of all whites. I would have to be slightly mentally retarded if I did not make some preparations, not to become insurrectionist, not to undermine my government, not to get involved in weapons and ammunition and all that kind of stuff, but just to take sensible precautions to ensure that I'm not the guy who gets caught sitting on the toilet with his pants around his ankles when the shit hits the fan, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
To be the guy who's standing up straight with his zipper done up and his belt tied tightly and better able to react than other people, if all of these things that the black leaders are now saying will happen, do happen.
So you've used a couple times now ethnic-based civil war. I believe that was the phrase.
Yes.
It sounds to me like it would be less of a civil war and more of the blacks hunting the white people.
Well, that is what we expect. Justin, at the risk of blowing our own trumpet, one has to be careful. Pride cometh before a fall. But our organization, because it's not hidebound by doctrine, is far and away, has been historically far and away the best forecaster of developments in our country. That has always been the case. That SOUTHLANDERS prognostications, SOUTHLANDERS weather reports are the most reliable because we're not politically correct about it. And we believe that what you've described now twice, or what you've put in those simple terms twice, is exactly what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. We tread carefully when speaking about these things, but yes, in a word, yes, we agree with what that statement.
So now, I know some people that are down in South Africa, some very capable people, and I'll use those people for the conversations regarding those things. But one of the things I'd like to ask you is, around the world, a lot of people who are empathetic to your situation, they over and over again ask, why don't you guys get the fuck out of there? I asked another friend of mine that once on the podcast, and he said, all I know is the bush. This is where I'm from. This is my land. And, these lands that we came from aren't my home. This is my home. And that was his situation. And that's all well and good. But how would you handle that question?
Well, I'm going to begin by endorsing what he said. When we landed here in the USA on the 3rd of March, or I beg your pardon, on the 4th of March, one of the first people whom we met is a US travel journalist. And he told me that he'd been to something like 151 of the world's 194 countries. And he said to me that South Africa is head, shoulders, thorax, and abdomen, the most beautiful country in the world. It's an easy country to love. And so many of us find it difficult to let go. It's not like you're kind of becoming an immigrant from Great Britain or somewhere bitter and miserable and rainy like that. No offense to the British Isles,
Right.
but there's a hang of a lot less reason to leave South Africa than there is the Orkney Islands, or I don't know where, what example to use. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that our population should be over 5.5 million. The white population in South Africa should be, by rights, if the growth trends of the 90s, the 70s, 80s, 90s had been extrapolated through until now, our population would be over 5.5 million. So already a tremendous chunk, a huge proportion of our people have left South Africa. 1/7, if my mental arithmetic is correct, 1 in 7 white people has emigrated from South Africa. And now we have a population of around about 4.7 million white people instead of something like 5.8 as it should be. So there are many people who do want to leave and who are leaving, but then there are people like me who have no interest in leaving and have never been interested in leaving, because to me it would be to capitulate to barbarianism. That's the way I see it. This is not the official standpoint of the SOUTHLANDERS as an organization. Speaking for myself, it would be to capitulate to something horrible. Our forefathers built with blood, sweat, and tears one of the most beautiful countries you can imagine. It's a gorgeous country that was once so successful that it costs $2 to buy one of our currency, the rand. We at one point in time had amongst the highest technological developments in the world. That is to say, we were competitive with any other country in terms of technological development, whether it was atom bombs or whatever else you like. We did good things. Our fathers did good things. And I'd like to remain there for what is right and good and true and beautiful, rather than turn my back and knowing that it's taken as a sign of weakness and failure by people who hate me.
All right. So I'm going to add, I mean, you may not know who this lady is. Have you ever heard of Karen Ann Smith?
Yes.
So I heard an interview that she gave on a friend of mine's podcast, maybe a year or two ago. And what I walked away from hearing her, now she is a native South African, or I think her family was raised in Rhodesia, you know, the artist formerly known as Rhodesia.
Yes.
And went from there to South Africa, and expat now living in Texas.
Yes.
And during this interview, what I came away from thinking is there's no way this is going to fucking change.
Yes.
Like, this is embedded in the identity of who these people are. And for listeners who, because I have people that love me that listen to my podcast and people that hate me that listen to my podcast.
Right.
So for the latter, I'm not saying that these people are incapable of great things. I'm not saying that they're incapable of coming together and organizing and being productive in any given sense. What I'm saying is they don't see this as the problem that we do. So it's not a matter of, you know, they're just retarded. It's really a matter of there is no motivation on that end to remedy this situation in any way that's acceptable to people, you know, I would say on our side of the equation.
There are things that may not be acceptable. I beg your pardon for interrupting, but what you're saying is a matter of fact, not opinion. This is not a contentious thing, what you've just said. It can't be. Because if there was a genuine, heartfelt desire to remedy this situation, people would be arriving at work on time and not leaving early. They would be industrious and productive, and they would be educating themselves, and they would be doing this, that, and the next thing. The simple reality, whether people like it or not, they can argue until they're blue in the face. If there was a desire to fix the problem, people would be endeavoring to fix the problem. Instead, the problem has worsened over time, and there is no indication. Lots of talk. Whoa, talk. We're the world champions at it. The African National Congress, nobody will ever beat or even meet the African National Congress for talking about leaving no stone unturned, investigating. It's all bullshit. Nothing ever changes and nothing ever gets done. So with all due respect to those people listening who may disagree, this is not an opinion. This is what you've said. It's just a matter of fact. The rest is another story. That's a different thing.
So with that in mind, how does this get resolved? Or is it just a matter of time until you guys have to fucking beat it with your cans of fuel and sandwiches?
Well, that's the way we look at it, you know, and I'm sure that to some people that sounds very silly, but to those of us who are determined to remain in the land that we love and to stand and to fight for what is good, there is no other way. We look on, we pay our taxes, we're industrious and productive. We hope that the government will come to its senses. We hope that our children won't be subjected to an armed conflict. God forbid. But when we apply common sense to the conundrum, it appears as if what you have just described is the only inevitable, ineluctable, unavoidable conclusion to this thing.
Right, right. So let me ask, now let's say we're living in la-la land, or we get to, you know, take a la-la pill and put our heads in the clouds for a moment, and we're going to go about changing the situation in South Africa legally, the right way, paperwork in order. In that, you know, imaginary scenario, how would South Africa fix itself?
The first thing that would have to happen is that a level of seriousness would have to be adopted in the highest echelons of government about administration, about industriousness and productivity, about putting man hours before Mercedes-Benzes and putting elbow grease before awards and putting conscientiousness before coin.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, that would have to be the first thing. You know, I'll give you one random example, Justin. The leading water engineers in our country have been saying for about 3 years that South Africa is 2 decades behind in the maintenance of its water system, and that at any moment there could be a cataclysm because the pipes are ruined. You know, I'm oversimplifying. 2 decades means that since the African National Congress assumed power, it has not cared for and maintained and repaired as it should have the entire national water infrastructure.
All right.
That same thing applies to many other spheres of our state, if you like. Sooner or later, these things are going to give way in spectacular fashion, and many people are going to be reduced to tears. Because the day that we have a severe water crisis in a densely populated area, and cholera breaks out, and men are half demented from listening to the screams of their thirsty children in their shacks, and they take to the streets to vent their frustration, all hell is going to break loose. And our government can't see that. The government struggles for foresight and forethought. Somebody asked me about this, and they said, if there were 2 character traits, or if there were 1 and then I made it 2, if there was a character trait which you believed was most missing from the government of South Africa now, what would it be? And I said, well, foresight as a talent, as an instinct, and then forethought as something to which you have to apply your mind. So the one is a kind of instinctive thing, and the other one is a deliberate action. I would say that those are the 2 great missing links in the governance of our country. I just can't see it.
So have you heard of and I don't even know the state of this situation, this I don't know if it's a municipality, a town, an area called Orania.
Yes, it's an enclave along the Orange River. The Orange River is our biggest river, and it runs from from Lesotho, which is a mountain kingdom within South Africa, and it runs all the way westwards to the Atlantic Ocean. And it forms the border for part of its length between South Africa and the state of Namibia to our north.
Mm-hmm.
Along the banks of the Orange River is a town called Orania. Originally, it was a town that was built mostly out of prefabricated buildings for the workers who erected a nearby dam, a very large dam that took many years to build, and it's in the middle of absolute nowhere. So they had to erect a temporary town there for these workers to be there. They couldn't be driving in, 200 miles to work every morning.
Right.
Once the dam was built, the town became derelict for many years. I think something like 2 decades, if I'm not mistaken, or close to it. Shortly prior to the elections of 1994, a very, very hardcore group of right-wing Afrikaners threatened to disrupt the elections of 1994. They were very dissatisfied in the fall of apartheid, and they were bitterly unhappy at seeing what was inevitable by that point, the country going into the hands of a communist entity like the African National Congress. As many people may know, Nelson Mandela, in spite of all of the people might say, I don't know, liberal university professors, Nelson Mandela was a member of the Central Committee of the South African Communist Party up to the day of his death. So the African National Congress is a communist party, finished and clear. So these people were bitterly unhappy. They were the very hardcore Christians, the land being given over to communists, blah, 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 blah. To mollify them, the then apartheid government and the forthcoming ANC government said to them, look, we tell you what, we will give you a small area of land where you can do your own thing and you can live in peace and quiet and you won't be influenced or affected by the new South Africa, which is what happened. And it remains there to this day, a small region, just a few miles in diameter, I would say, where about a few thousand very right-wing Afrikaners live in a very quiet, peaceful, neat, clean, tidy village.
Now, is that maybe a viable model for white South Africans moving forward?
It's not an option, regrettably, Justin. The government will not entertain any notion of secession or independent homelands or anything like that. That one is already, as it is, a thorn in their side, not least because of its success. It has its flaws, but it has by and large been much more successful than many places in South Africa over the past 23 years. I gather through the grapevine, some people that I know well are closely associated with Orania, and I have been told that on a number of occasions, the Orania people have applied for permission to expand their borders because of the demand for participation in Orania, as people have seen it succeed, but the government is absolutely not interested, and regrettably, it's not on the table, anything like that.
All right. So now, as we wind down, you are here in the U.S. right now, and you are on a mission. That mission is twofold. Let my listeners know exactly how they could find out more info and how they could help you and your organization.
Okay. The mission is twofold, as you said. The first is to raise funds. That is our core primary purpose on this mission through the USA. We've driven now just over 11,000 miles to different people all around the USA, giving presentations about what's happening in South Africa with the purpose of raising funds. And allied to that is getting the story out. If people want to know more about where they can see us, or if people would like to host us in a certain area, just as I received a phone call this afternoon to invite us to speak in Virginia, they are welcome to send me an email, and my email address is hk@suidlanders.co.za, hk@suidlanders. If they would like to know more about the tour, details of the tour, they can look at the website southafricasos.org, southafricasos.org. And if they would like to donate, they can go on to our website, that same one that I've just mentioned, southafricasos.org. There are PayPal links there, or they can go on to the website SOUTHLANDERS.org. So there are various means of getting in touch with me. There are links on those websites to getting in touch with me. There are various means to donate. There are various ways to find out more.
Very good. And we will have every one of those links that you just mentioned on the episode page on thepressureproject.com. So if anybody's listening to this podcast episode and wants to find those links, you can go to thepressureproject.com and just look up this particular episode, and all of those links will be there. Okay, Simon, this has been a very informative, very, very interesting talk. Give us some final thoughts, and then we'll wrap it up, my friend.
Well, the final thoughts that I'd like to give, Justin, are a thanks to people like yourself and others who have hosted us in the USA so far. On a number of occasions, we've been asked, what is the best thing about America? And I don't know what answer people expected to get, but we've only ever given one answer. It is the human quality, the genetic goodness of the people that we've met in the USA, the people that we've had to deal with, the people that we have dealt with directly, whether it be radio interviews or presentations or whatever. It has been such an outstanding thing. I didn't expect it myself. No offense to Americans, but as I said to a girl the other day, we find ourselves over and over again in the company of people where you find yourself thinking, I would give my daughter's hand in marriage to any man in this room. Good people. And those are my final thoughts. Thank you, Justin.
Well, Simon, thank you so much. I commend your efforts, your mission. You are doing good work. And I think it's conversations like these that allow for a little bit more of an articulation of some of these very, very, dynamic situations that people who aren't there want to paint with a broad brush one way or another.
Yes.
So thank you so much for that. I appreciate you coming on. And who knows, maybe I'll have you on in the future. You can give us an update, hopefully a good one.
Well, I hope so. Let's see what happens. We think that the next 3 months are going to be quite tense in South Africa. So you never know. I might be coming on to report something to you before you expect it.
Well, who knows? Maybe the next interview will be from the president's office in South Africa. All right, my friend. Thank you. I'm signing off, and I will send you a link when this episode goes live.
Thank you very much, Justin, and thank you for your patience with all of the troubles in sorting this interview out, getting it going.
No worries, my friend. No worries at all. All right, my man. Have a good night.
Good night, and God bless you, Justin.
Thank you.